Let's just dive right into this explainer, because today we are unraveling one of the absolute most fascinating evolutionary mysteries in ancient literature. We're going to trace how a tiny, seemingly insignificant footnote in ancient history completely transformed over the centuries into a terrifying demonic icon. Just imagine a character so obscure that they barely get a passing mention in a single line of text, and then, hundreds of years later, they've somehow become this central, horrifying figure in ancient cosmology. Well, that is the wild, incredible story of Naamah.
And the ultimate paradox of this whole story actually begins with her very name. The name Naamah derives from the Hebrew root nun ayin mim, and this specific semantic field was meant to evoke aesthetic beauty and moral pleasantness. It literally translates to pleasant, beautiful, or agreeable. So naturally, when you hear a name like that, you're thinking of a benevolent figure, right? Maybe a hero or a peaceful matriarch. You definitely aren't picturing a monster. And that creates this immense inherent tension, because, as we dig into the later interpretations, the historical reality of her mythology goes in the exact opposite direction.
But here is where things go completely off the rails, and it brilliantly illustrates the high-contrast mystery we're looking at today. If we fast forward to the 13th century, mystical texts suddenly and violently clash with that innocent name. The Zohar, which is this foundational work of Jewish mystical thought, frames her not as pleasant, but literally as the mother of demons and spirits. So how exactly do we get from a beautiful, agreeable sister to a cosmic architect of nightmares? It's a staggering leap in character development. I mean, we are talking about a complete 180-degree flip that absolutely begs for an explanation.
To really understand this, we need to look at what I like to call the snowball effect of mythological storytelling. Centuries of texts were literally layered on top of one another to slowly build up this demonic persona. We start way back with a brief biblical origin in the ancient era, which is basically just our historical kernel. Then we move into rabbinic elaboration in late antiquity, where the theological wheels really start turning. Next up, we hit a massive mystical expansion in the medieval era, where these incredibly complex esoteric systems are built around her. And finally, we arrive at modern occult and academic analysis, where her entire role gets reevaluated. It's essentially this giant game of historical telephone spanning thousands of years, where the story just gets wilder with every single retelling. And the craziest part is that the entire foundation of her existence starts with a single, incredibly brief, and totally neutral mention in the book of Genesis. Chapter 4, verse 22 simply reads, "The sister of Tubal-Cain was Naamah." That's it. She's placed within the lineage of Cain, listed simply as the daughter of Lamech and Zillah and the sister of Tubal-Cain, who was an early blacksmith. The text gives us absolutely zero evaluation of her character. She isn't good, bad, holy, or demonic. It is a completely blank historical canvas. But, as you'll see, in the world of ancient theology, a blank canvas is basically an open invitation.
Because human nature absolutely abhors a vacuum. And well, so does theology. Rabbinic and Kabbalistic traditions eagerly stepped in to fill that biblical silence. First, rabbinic texts in the Talmudic era started speculating about her role in pre-flood society. The logic was pretty straightforward. If she was mentioned at all, she must have been important, right? Some early thinkers even theorized she might have been Noah's wife. But then, the Zohar drastically escalates things, entirely stripping away her innocence by framing her as this powerful seductress who led astray the angels themselves, the literal sons of God. Ultimately, the broader medieval Kabbalistic tradition completely solidifies her as a demonic entity, one who is deeply tied to the earthly corruption that necessitated the Great Flood in the first place. So, that silence, it was filled with pure chaos.
Now, to really grasp Naamah's highly specific function, it helps to put her side by side with another famous demon you probably already know, Lilith. Lilith is said to predate the completion of creation itself. She has a stronger biblical foundation, with hints in the book of Isaiah, and her primary demonic function is threatening children and childbirth. But Naamah, she comes from a concrete historical genealogy. Her demonization happens entirely after the Bible was written, and her domain is laser-focused. She's primarily associated with male seduction and testing spiritual discipline. So while they share the stage as feminine demonic figures, their origins and their terrifying specialties are totally distinct.
Which brings us to a very significant number in ancient demonology, 4. By the time medieval Jewish mysticism fully develops, Naamah isn't just some background character anymore. She has literally climbed the ranks of the underworld to become royalty. She becomes firmly established as one of the 4 legendary mothers of demons, ruling right alongside Lilith, Agrot Bat Mahlat, and Isheth Zenunum. Together, this dark quartet was believed to reign over nocturnal activities and earthly corruption. She went all the way from being a blacksmith's pleasant sister to holding a permanent seat on the Supreme Council of the Underworld.
But as we trace this incredible textual detective story, we really have to pause and ask the underlying psychological question here. Why? Why did these religious communities need to invent this specific monster? What real-world purpose did turning the pleasant Naamah into a demon actually serve for the scholars and mystics who were writing these texts over the centuries? It certainly doesn't happen by accident, so there has to be a utility to all this terror.
Well, the answer lies in how ancient societies utilized demonic figures as profound theological tools. First off, they helped explain the problem of evil, giving a literal, tangible face to the very human question of why bad things happen, why temptation exists, and why good people sometimes fall. Secondly, figures like Naamah establish super clear dualistic boundaries between the sacred and the profane, basically providing a feminine principle of corruption to contrast with divine authority. Third, by showing people exactly what not to do, they defined acceptable behavior through extreme negative examples. And finally, believing in a shared mythology creates incredibly deep in-group cohesion, because honestly, a community bonds together pretty strongly when they're defending themselves against the exact same terrifying shadow in the night.
And anthropologists will be the first to point out that this isn't just an isolated phenomenon limited to one specific region or text. Societies all over the globe relied on destructive, otherworldly female figures to map out human fears. Whether it's the Mesopotamian goddess Inanna crossing volatile divine boundaries, the Greek sirens acting as these destructive forces luring sailors to their doom, or the Celtic beansai appearing as terrifying otherworldly omens, the pattern is remarkably consistent everywhere you look. Naamah is simply the specific, localized manifestation of a deeply universal human impulse to give a face and a name to the unknown, the forbidden, and the feared.
Digging even deeper into this, when we analyze these historical texts neutrally today, modern gender studies offer a super fascinating perspective. The prevailing theory here is that Naamah basically became a convenient repository for patriarchal projection. Essentially, the men who were writing these theological treatises over the centuries were externalizing their own deep-seated cultural anxieties right onto her character. Anxieties about the loss of male authority, fears surrounding the intellectual equality of women, and strict concerns over uncontrolled feminine sexuality. All of it got bundled up and placed squarely onto her. So Naamah the demon, in this view, reflects the insecurities of the medieval scholars who wrote her story, rather than any actual supernatural threat. And that leads us to a really fascinating modern twist, because contemporary feminist readings and psychological applications have completely flipped the script yet again. Today, Naamah is actually experiencing a reclamation. Instead of a monster you're supposed to fear, modern interpretations often view her as a symbol of positive feminine power and a keeper of forbidden wisdom traditions. She's seen as a figure of resistance against the very patriarchal control that originally tried to demonize her. Furthermore, in psychology, particularly in Jungian analysis, she represents the necessary integration of the shadow self. This is the idea that we all have to acknowledge and accept the darker, repressed parts of human nature, our own personal Naamahs, if you will, rather than suppressing or fearing them. Because by facing the shadow, we actually become whole.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, we've watched Naamah evolve from a brief, completely neutral mention in Genesis to a terrifying nocturnal demon and finally into a modern symbol of empowerment and psychological integration. Her journey is just an unbelievable testament to the immense power of storytelling and interpretation. I want to leave you with one final thought to consider about how we interact with mythology and our own modern shadows. When we project our deepest fears onto ancient texts, are we really reading history, or are we just looking in a mirror? Definitely something to think about the next time you encounter a monster in a story.